I woke up to a cacophony of voices, cheers mingling with lively chatter. My stomach somersaulted as I realized the voices were at my door. I stumbled out of bed and fumbled for my robe, the fog of sleep still hanging heavy in my head. As I opened the door, I was met with a blast of music and a surge of strangers. They surged into my apartment, their faces unfamiliar, their laughter jarring. My brain scrambled to make sense of the chaos. "Surprise!" they screamed, but their voices held a sinister undertone. I recognized a few acquaintances from my old neighborhood, but most were complete strangers. They crowded my living room, their expressions a mix of amusement and something darker, more unsettling. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a prickle of fear crawling beneath my skin. They had decorated my living room with gaudy decorations, streamers hanging haphazardly, balloons floating like grotesque ornaments. A table in the corner groaned under the weight of snacks and drinks, but the smell of something rotten hung in the air. The atmosphere was thick with tension, each stranger's gaze lingering on me with a predatory intensity. As they poured into my kitchen, I felt trapped, an outsider in my own home. The realization that these strangers had no right to be here sank in, sending a wave of panic through me. My birthday had been transformed into a grotesque nightmare. One of the women, a short, heavy-set stranger with piercing blue eyes, approached me, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "Happy birthday," she purred, her voice dripping with venom. "We've come to celebrate." My hands clenched into fists, but I held back the urge to scream, to lash out. I felt a deep, suffocating fear, knowing that if I showed any sign of weakness, they would pounce. Instead, I plastered a fake smile on my face, desperate to hide my terror. They spent hours torturing me with their bizarre charade, their laughter echoing off the walls like the sound of fingernails scraping on a chalkboard. They tore down my decorations, spilling drinks on my carpet and snatching food from my table. All the while, their eyes never left me, their gazes heavy with contempt. As the night wore on, their behavior became increasingly unhinged. They began to whisper among themselves, their words laced with threats and a strange, incomprehensible language. Panic surged through me as I realized they were not just strangers, but something far more sinister. I knew I had to escape, but every time I tried to slip away, they closed in on me, their bodies blocking my path. I felt their cold, clammy hands brush my skin, and a sense of doom washed over me. It dawned on me that they had not come to celebrate my birthday, but to shatter it. As the first rays of dawn pierced through the cracks in my curtains, the strangers retreated as quickly as they had arrived. The apartment lay in ruins, the remnants of their malevolence scattered across the floor. In the aftermath of their invasion, I was left with an overwhelming sense of violation and fear. The once familiar walls of my home now seemed to close in on me, suffocating me with the memories of that fateful night. My birthday had been stolen from me, irrevocably tainted by the shadows that had inhabited my living room. Even now, years later, the scars of that night still haunt me. I never learned the identity of those strangers, nor their motives. But I know that they will forever be etched in the darkest corners of my memory, a reminder of the night my birthday turned into a terrifying nightmare. I'm not one for birthdays. Never have been. But this one was different. I'd been dreading it for weeks, ever since I got the invitation. It was from an old friend, someone I hadn't seen in years. We'd grown apart, gone our separate ways. But apparently, she'd decided to throw a big bash for her 30th, and I was on the guest list. I hesitated at first. I didn't really want to go, but I didn't want to be rude either. So I RSVP'd yes and tried to forget about it. The day of the party, I almost chickened out. But something kept telling me I had to go. So I reluctantly drove to her house, my stomach churning with nerves. When I arrived, I was greeted by a scene that was both familiar and strange. The house was dimly lit, and there was music playing from somewhere downstairs. I could hear voices and laughter, but it all sounded muffled, like it was coming from a distant room. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The living room was crowded with people, but I didn't recognize any of them. They were all strangers, and they all seemed to be watching me. I felt uncomfortable and out of place. I wished I'd stayed home after all. Then I saw her. My old friend, the one who'd invited me. She was standing in the corner, wearing a long black dress. She looked different, I thought. Older, thinner, almost haggard. I made my way through the crowd and went to greet her. When I did, she smiled and hugged me. "I'm so glad you came," she said. "I've missed you." Her voice was soft and sweet, but there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. It was too saccharine, too forced. We chatted for a bit, and she introduced me to some of her friends. They were all nice enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were all watching me. After a while, I excused myself to go to the restroom. As I made my way down the hall, I noticed a door that was slightly ajar. I couldn't help myself. I had to know what was behind it. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, and I could smell something sweet and sickly. I took a few steps forward and then stopped. There, in the center of the room, was a table. On the table was a cake. A birthday cake with 13 candles. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew this was not right. There were only 12 people at the party, including me. So why was there a cake with 13 candles? I turned to leave, but the door was stuck. I tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. I heard a noise behind me and turned to face it. The candles on the cake had been lit. The flame flickered and danced, casting an eerie glow on the room. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway. A tall, thin figure with long, black hair. The figure took a step towards me, and I realized with horror that it was my friend. But it wasn't the friend I knew. This was something else. Her eyes were empty and black, and her skin was as pale as death. She was smiling, but it was a cruel and twisted smile. She reached out towards me, and I screamed. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It had all been a dream. but it had felt so real. I sat up and looked around. I was in my own bedroom, safe and sound. But even though I knew it was just a dream, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I got out of bed and went to the window. I pulled back the curtains and looked outside. It was dark, and the only light came from the street lamps. I scanned the street, looking for anything unusual. And then I saw it. Standing on the sidewalk, across the street from my house, was a figure. A tall, thin figure with long, black hair. I stared at the figure for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. And then it turned and walked away. I watched it go, and then I closed the curtains. I didn't know what it was or what it wanted, but I knew that I was in danger. I'm not sure what's going to happen to me, but I have a feeling that my life is about to change forever. I remember that night as if it were yesterday. It was my 30th birthday party, and I'd invited all my closest friends and family. The party was in full swing, the music was blasting, and everyone was having a great time. In the midst of the celebration, I noticed a strange man standing in the corner of the room. He was tall and lanky, with piercing blue eyes and a strange, unreadable expression on his face. I had never seen him before, and he didn't seem to belong. I walked up to him and introduced myself. He introduced himself as Ethan, and he said he was a friend of one of my friends. I invited him to join us, but he just stood there, staring at me with an unnerving intensity. As the night went on, Ethan made me increasingly uncomfortable. He kept following me around, asking me questions about my life. He seemed overly interested in me, and his questions were oddly personal. I tried to ignore him, but he wouldn't leave me alone. He would just stand there, staring at me, his eyes boring into me. I started to get scared, and I asked him to leave. He just smiled and said, "Not yet." I called for my friends to escort him out, but when they went to find him, he had disappeared. I was terrified, and I spent the rest of the night on edge. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Ethan, and it was filled with disturbing threats and promises. He said he had been watching me, and he knew everything about me. He said he had a present for me, and I had to come to a certain address to receive it. I was terrified, but I knew I couldn't ignore him. I went to the address, and there he was waiting for me. He had a box in his hand, and he smiled at me, a wicked gleam in his eyes. "This is for you," he said, and he handed me the box. I opened it and my stomach turned. Inside was the severed head of my beloved dog. I screamed and dropped the box, and Ethan laughed. He lunged at me and I ran for my life. He pursued me through the deserted streets, his footsteps echoing behind me like a death knell. Finally, I couldn't run anymore. I collapsed to the ground, sobbing in terror. Ethan stood over me, his cold eyes glinting in the dim moonlight. "You can't escape me," he whispered. "I will always be with you." And with that, he raised his knife and plunged it into my heart.